Welcome to this GCSE Science tutorial video on energy resources, wind and water. This video is part 3 of 6 videos on the topic of energy resources. So for full coverage of this topic, please start at part 1. For great GCSE Science content, be sure to subscribe and remember to check us out on TikTok, where we post GCSE Science videos daily. Wind power is a renewable energy resource that uses wind to generate electricity. In every boat that has a sail, wind power is used and has therefore been used for centuries. However, in more modern times, we have utilised the power of wind to generate electricity using wind turbines. Wind turbines are placed in places that receive a lot of wind, such as in coastal areas or wide open fields. So how does a wind turbine work? Well, the blades turn a generator found inside the turbine, and this generates electricity. We will now describe the advantages and disadvantages of wind power. Well, an advantage of wind power is that it does not produce polluting gases, such as carbon dioxide or sulfur dioxide. Another advantage is that the wind turbines do not require fuel to operate, so they have low operating costs. Our third and final advantage is that wind power is a renewable energy resource. In other words, there will always be wind. A disadvantage of wind power is that it is an unreliable energy resource. In other words, it is not always windy. So the blades are not always turning to generate electricity. Also, to produce wind power, there are high manufacturing and startup costs. Now, imagine looking at loads of wind turbines when you're at the beach or out of the window of your home in the countryside. They do not look great. So, wind turbines are said to be a source of visual pollution. And when wind turbines are in motion, they do transfer energy in the form of sound waves to the surroundings, so they make a lot of noise. Wind turbines are also, therefore, a source of noise pollution. However, this noise and visual pollution is not permanent. So imagine the wind turbines were removed and placed elsewhere. The pollution would cease and the landscape would look just as it did before. Moving on now to water, and water is used as an energy resource to generate electricity using hydroelectric power, tidal power and wave power. Hydroelectric power is a renewable energy resource that utilises falling water to generate electricity. So how then can we use hydroelectric power to generate electricity? Well, firstly, a large amount of water is being held behind a dam above the ground. This water is then released when electricity is required, and it flows downhill and turns a turbine, which turns a generator, which generates electricity. Now for the advantages of hydroelectric power. Firstly then, we can say that an advantage of hydroelectric power is that it is a renewable energy resource. We will always have a water source. A second advantage of hydroelectric power is that it is very reliable. Hydroelectric power does not rely on the wind or the sun shining. like wind power or solar power respectively. A third advantage is that there are no polluting gases produced, such as carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide. There is also an immediate response when electricity is required. So as soon as electricity is required, the water is released and will start flowing downhill to turn the turbines. And our last advantage, running costs are very low and no fuel is required to produce hydroelectric power. Now for our disadvantages, and the first disadvantage of hydroelectric power is that building dams that hold the water up at a height causes flooding. And this can cause damage to valley habitats and villages. And in some cases, these villages may need to be destroyed. There can also be rotting vegetation, and this is due to the flooding. And this can cause polluting gases such as carbon dioxide and methane to be produced. And dams and hydroelectric power stations more generally, although impressive from an engineering perspective, can be seen as unsightly. Therefore, are considered by many as a cause of visual pollution. Tidal power is another way in which water is utilized to generate electricity. Tidal power is a renewable energy resource that utilizes the moon's gravitational force that creates the tides to generate electricity. This top part of the diagram represents what happens at high tide. When the tide is high, water is trapped by a type of dam called a tidal barrage. Here the tidal barrage is closed. However, at low tide, the tidal barrage is opened and water is then released at a constant rate out through piping that turns a turbine that spins the generator that then generates electricity. The water then simply flows back into the sea. Now for the advantages of tidal power. Our first advantage is that it is a renewable energy resource. Water is not going to run out. So as long as there is human life on planet Earth, there will always be water and tides. Another advantage of tidal power is that there are very low operating costs. A third advantage of tidal power is that no polluting gases are produced, such as carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide. Another advantage is that tidal power is reliable. Tides happen twice per day, every day. The tide is therefore quite predictable, therefore energy output is fairly predictable. In other words, you know how much electricity is going to be generated. Now let's describe the disadvantages of tidal power. The first is that manufacturing and startup costs are quite high. Tidal barrages are not cheap to build. And this leads us on nicely to our second disadvantage, in that when building barrages, and this happens mainly in estuaries, can affect bird and animal habitats, and also that of other marine life. Now, remember we mentioned an advantage of tidal power being that the tides and therefore the energy output is predictable, which is very helpful. However, the tide height does vary throughout the year. Therefore, the tide height is variable. This means, therefore, that energy output also varies. Unfortunately, tidal barrages also can prevent boats from accessing ports. This can negatively impact local economies. For example, tourism. And our last disadvantage of tidal power is that not all estuaries are suitable to install barrages. Lastly, we have wave power. Wave power is a renewable energy resource that utilizes the kinetic energy store of sea waves to generate electricity. Floating turbine-like structures that are powered by waves are placed in coastal areas. These structures are linked to the shore via cables shown here. And these cables are attached to the local power grid. What then are the advantages of wave power? Well, first of all, it is renewable. There is always water and there are always waves. Another advantage is that wave power produces no polluting gases such as carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide. Another advantage is that there are no fuel costs associated with wave power. And also, operating costs are very low. Now for the disadvantages of wave power. The first is that it is unreliable. This is because when it is not windy, wave power decreases. Another disadvantage is that manufacturing and startup costs are high. The cables that run along the seabed can damage marine habitats and marine life. These cables are also a source of visual pollution, as they do not look particularly nice on the seabed. This visual pollution also extends to buildings on the coast receiving the power. Furthermore, boats could collide with the turbine-like structures or the cables, therefore they are hazards. Our last disadvantage of wave power is that it does not produce huge amounts of energy, so is best suited to small islands only. So that is it, you've made it, the end of the video. Thank you once again for choosing Genius Science, and remember to work hard, be kind, and we'll see you in the next video. Take care.